Hey everyone, hope you guys are well. Welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 3 transfer plans. We're looking at, unfortunately, one of the worst game weeks, or probably combined game weeks successively of all time, I think, for most elite managers. I'm not saying I'm elite necessarily, but just obviously in terms of engaged managers, I think there's clearly been a struggle, unless you, let's say, own João Pedro or have had some really nice auto bench jam. Before I jump into the transfer plans, I'd love to shout out Fantasy Football Hub. This is a great time to still join. You got 50% off up until the end of this month, and the offer still stands in terms of winning your mini league or getting your money back. You can have a look at all the pro tools available that will help you with actually maximizing points, especially the suggested transfers from the AI Hub tool, and have a look at the link in the description below for all that. I can easily put my hands up this week and say the first thing to look at is I definitely got my bench order wrong. Not because of course of the outcome, but just specifically the order was just wrong anyways. It should have been Porro, Romero, Gu. And I don't know why I didn't really pay attention to it. Probably because I was so bought into, let's say, City being able to score versus Spurs, and that clearly not happening, that I had completely forgot to reset my bench order, even when I was on stream. So I ended up getting Gu as an auto sub for Palmer. We still don't know what Salah's going to do. I don't think it's going to massively change my rank, but that is a pretty big swing, right? That's 4 points in terms of a swing. And then we did make a move from Jorginho Rutter to Reinders, and so that removed, I guess, the need for another auto sub, but it would have been a lovely world, wouldn't it, if we had the bench order right and we had auto subs as well. But that's not why I'm sort of making the video and kind of explaining. I think simply it has been a poor start, but then when I actually look at a lot of the players that I own, are they still good logical picks? Like, in theory, yes, right? There's a lot of picks in other positions that I don't own right now that I think a lot of people still think are good picks that haven't done a single thing in FPL this season. And that can happen. So I think it's just worth remembering that FPL is a season where you'll have multiple weeks where you have poor game week ranks, but you're just hoping that you have multiple weeks of better game week ranks, and that kind of edges out the amount of poor weeks you have, and suddenly you have a good finish. So am I worried about my rank right now? No. Is this the worst start I've ever had, by a country mile? Yes. But that's pretty much where it ends, where I don't worry about it, because the only thing that I look at and can look at really is when I look at my team, what are the issues? What are the almost immediate solutions? So we take a step back, right? Just look at the 30-point producing team here. I mean, I think I was actually happy with making the Reinders move. Rutter's injury is really unfortunate. I have to say Fabian Hertzler is an absolute troll. So anyone who actually got Rutter, I think that's tough in terms of trying to manage that injury going forwards, because you don't exactly know when he's going to come back to play, because Fabian isn't really great with establishing timelines. What I think is nice about Rutter is you're looking at Welbeck now. He looks awful, and O'Reilly still really isn't super comfortable playing that 10 position. I don't think he's exactly as mobile as a player, as fluid as a player as João Pedro or Rutter is in that position. So I really feel like Rutter in the long term is going to be a good pick. Why I made that move towards Reinders, as I said, is because I felt confident in his minutes. Did he also stink it up as part of that whole City, collapse and defeat versus a very solid Tottenham team for the most part? Absolutely. And did I get that wrong once again? Absolutely. I think one thing to mention in terms of Spurs, yes, of course, they've always been a bogey team in Man City, but as someone who's obviously a little bit more open to, let's say, looking at odds, changing my decisions based on sort of objective data like that, I just have to say that sometimes we kind of confuse correlation and causation. I'm not saying that this is the case here. I think it's very evident that City have always struggled versus Spurs, but in terms of not being able to even score versus Spurs, that's more of a recent trend under Pep. Right? We've always seen, let's say, chaotic games where, let's say, maybe a Spurs will get a draw versus City, back when, let's say, Kane was playing, or even, let's say, where they just edge out a win and maybe they actually, created less chances. But for City to be so, I guess, hapless versus Spurs is something that I think is new, and I think is also unrealistic, right? That the City team, I suppose, can't score versus Spurs, but it did happen, and there were some really good saves as well from Vicario. But fair enough to anyone who actually played their Spurs players or got the Spurs auto subs. I think that's totally fine. Did it elapse me completely? And I think ultimately, am I really just unhappy about getting the 4 points back? Pretty much. And I have to say that's down to my own fault, right? So no complaints there. But that is the game week in a nutshell. And hopefully Salah can resuscitate a bit of it, because we only have 1 point of auto subs. So we're looking at effectively 31 points right now, which is just embarrassing. But when I look at the players, like Anderson still looks like a solid pick. I think Fulham actually looked really impressive versus United. The penalty was a bit of a gift, if I'm honest. I'm kind of confused why the Euro goal was allowed. I'm not going to speak too much about that, but Fulham actually looks pretty solid. There are better games on the horizon for Anderson. So him actually being able to get DEFCON after, I think, in the first half getting 0 DEFCONs is wonderful. Estev, the clean sheet was nice. Did I want to go Dubravka over Sanchez? By the deadline, I think when I started my deadline stream, I had Dubravka over Sanchez. But to me, it was always going to be a 50-50. So that turning to be, let's say, one player get a clean sheet, one player not getting a clean sheet, is something that I can't really worry about, because when I even look at the Chelsea games and the Burnley games with a bit of hindsight, I don't think the quality of chances that, let's say, Sunderland put against Burnley were necessarily much worse than, let's say, the chances that West Ham put against Chelsea. Like, really, Sanchez is just at fault for that first goal. And that's it. I can't really complain. I think I was happy with the goalkeepers, whomever I put out. And then Murillo, I think he's probably the most disappointing defender that I have in my draft entirely. Like, obviously I can say that because I have 2 players on my bench sat with 5 points and 7 points respectively. But I think that the thing that is even more dismaying about Murillo is we've had these discussions for a while now in terms of Tarkowski versus Murillo, these 2 players who actually have really similar numbers. And actually, Tarkowski's got in DEFCON for 2 games in a row. Murillo hasn't really come close towards that figure of 10, which is a bit shocking considering what his previous year averages are. Nottingham Forest also have become a little bit more possession dominant as a side, so you can say that there's a bit of a tactical change up potentially, or maybe it's just the specific games that have played so far that have sort of allowed for this, but that has changed a lot of the baselines, unfortunately, for the Nottingham Forest players, and it's not a great look, right, for owning Murillo, because a lot of his value, I think, at 5.5 is pretty much that he can get you these defensive contributions, and of course the fixtures were very good to hopefully get expected clean sheets as well. And I think it's nice, to be honest, that the fixtures are still better, right? That Nottingham Forest's games still look good. But it's just not a great start in terms of what this Murillo pick has produced compared to some of the other top picks, especially some of the 6.0s who've already gotten double clean sheets or, got into bonus, maybe got an assist like Kukureya has. But I think I'm just going to have to persist with him. And I'll talk about why I'm not planning to wildcard 3 at the moment. I clearly have already used 1 free transfer. And in the midfield, Bruno missing a penalty, that's almost like a 7-8 point swing, but I can't complain. This is just simply my player missing a penalty. Like, what can I do? He still got 2 defensive contributions points back, and then United actually conceded a goal, which I think was more than fair versus Fulham. I think Fulham actually played really well, probably played better than United on paper. I mean, when you look at the chances that both teams created in open play, including some of the set pieces, I think Fulham were probably actually dominant, to be honest. Sarr, Ismaila Sarr, my first non-Salah goal of the season. We're 2 game weeks in, and I feel like this might even be my first non-goal or assist, right? So, I mean, Rutter got a penalty assist last week, but it's been a struggle, right, to get points. And so it's nice to have Sarr almost open that tally there and his account. And I've got at least, a little bit of an avenue towards that Sunderland game in game week 4. And Palmer missing is disappointing, right? I captained Palmer, so I really wanted to get something out of Palmer. I just thought that West Ham were very poor and worth taking a chance on, especially when you compare the kind of fixture quality gap there between Salah and Palmer, despite recognizing that Salah is clearly better than Palmer as a standalone pick. But yeah, that's it. It's a shame because I've been on I was on Palmer, I think, after I posted the team selection. I had a little bit more of a thought about it and thought, just given my risk preference, given all the times that I've gone Palmer versus Salah, and the opportunity here once again with the great fixture gulf, why would I not go Palmer? So I went for Palmer, and as it turns out, nothing happened, right? As Palmer didn't get to play football, Chelsea absolutely demolished, and João Pedro did amazing. And I think on this note, what's worth about Palmer is a lot of people are looking for avenues and exits out of Palmer, but I think the issue for a lot of people is with 2 free transfers, right? Not in my case where I only have 1, is what to do with those 2 free transfers. I kind of think that a lot of people are in similar camps where you have 3 to 4 players in your attack who are all blanking. Now, if you have João Pedro, you're probably just laughing at me instead. But, João Pedro has just become a much better pick if Palmer's out. And I still think that groin injury is a little bit suspect, right? Sure, it's precautionary that he's been removed from the game. But to be quite honest, I think if he was ready to almost play and then suddenly something almost came up, which created that sort of precaution, I do think that it's probably a little bit more severe. I think it's likely that we might actually not see Palmer until game week 4, which comes after the international break. And I think that's probably the most likely scenario, if I'm honest, as to how we interpret Cole Palmer going forwards. But I have to say Chelsea still look really good. I would not be worried about owning Palmer as a pick, which is why I think even though I am in a bit of a flimsy spot having used 1 free transfer already, that Palmer pick is still really solid in FPL, and I don't see the need necessary to move off of it, and probably because I don't have the same luxuries as other managers. Whereas if you have 2 free transfers, you probably can consider something like moving towards a 3-4-3. you can consider also staying within the 3-5-2. And what interesting picks are there? I think Cunha is the most obvious midfield pick right now, with Saka most likely out for Game Week 3 himself, and doesn't have a good game anyways as it stands versus Liverpool. I think Palmer to Cunha makes a lot of sense. You actually get that Burnley at home game. Cunha's minutes look pretty much perfect. I think, if anything, he's probably the United attacker that I've been most impressed with in open play. And Bomo has been really good in terms of the set pieces, but nothing really exceptional in terms of, let's say, open play. I think Cunha has always caught my eye over the last 2 games, and United were overall much more or much less impressive versus Burnley, or Fulham rather. So I am expecting a lot more at home versus Burnley, where Cunha will hopefully do quite well. So I think he's an interesting pick, right, as a midfielder to go to. And that clearly opens up a move away from a lot of managers, from someone like Mark Yu, who's clearly not playing a lot of minutes as it stands. So moving Yu to, let's say, maybe a João Pedro seems quite obvious for a lot of managers, because there just really isn't any other forward who's impressive or just has a good fixture run or is reliable, right? Fulcrum, someone who's actually got reduced minutes. Thiago's still interesting, to be honest. He's probably the cheapest pick right now that a lot of people are still ignoring. And he has Sunderland next. So he's actually an interesting pick if you actually want to spend a little bit less money, but are comfortable with moving towards another forward here in this case. But I think in my camp, it's probably going to be the one free transfer territory. Maybe a bit of yo-yo here in terms of, let's say, going Palmer to Cunha and then back to Palmer potentially. That's unfortunately, I think, how I have to play it, with me being a little bit too aggressive, I suppose, in Game Week 1 and now suffering the consequences of it a bit. And I think there's other people who are in much worse positions. Like, people have Rutter still, people have Palmer, people have Saka, maybe the combination of all three. And suddenly that prompts things like, what do I do? Do I wildcard? I really think that this is still a season to wildcard 4. I know some people will wildcard 3. I will create a video for people who are going to wildcard 3. But I think just give it some thought, right? Because Game Week 3 is still a boring game week, and we can talk about it just through the fixtures. Like, if I was to recap this week in terms of how I actually feel about all the teams that played and how the matches actually played out. West Ham versus Chelsea, I have to say, yeah, West Ham were just poor. City versus Spurs, I think City probably should have scored as expected, but Spurs just looked like a really, really solid team. They were expected to concede much more chances when you kind of look at the implied expected goals that City were going to have. And I think they were, a goal shy of that, really, in terms of the expected goals conceded. So that's just impressive for Spurs, and it makes the defense that I look a little bit better going forwards. Now I just need to play that defense, right? Bournemouth and Wolves, as far as that, I mean, there was a red card in that game, but Bournemouth probably didn't do as much as we thought in terms of damage. Brentford versus Villa, I think Villa have just been, I don't even know what to say about this team. It just looks so static, and they don't create a lot over the course of the match. They probably control less of the ball than you think a team that is set up to control as much of the ball should. So that's unimpressive. Brentford, as I said last week, I think when you have this team with their starting 11, with Dango back, with Sade starting, with Damsgaard in the team, that's a dramatically different team. So no surprise that Brentford were able to get a result there. But I think it was actually a close match in terms of the chances, right? Villa probably still, at the end of the day, should have scored. And Watkins had a few chances, nothing significant though. No big, high impactful chances. But they do have better and better games anyway. So it's one of those cases where, yes, of course, Watkins has been absolutely terrible. And if I just look back quickly at my team, yeah, like Watkins is, when you look at Watkins this week, it's so obvious that everyone wants to think about Gyökeres because he's at the same price point. He was a considered transfer, especially after that Havertz news came out. But we've kind of missed the boat on that. And I kind of think we have to almost embrace, if you at least are a Watkins owner, fixtures like Sunderland away, Everton away, etc., and Burnley at home, more crucially in Game Week 7. So I think I will be, unfortunately, stuck with Watkins as long as I persist with this team and don't pull the trigger on an early wild card. As far as Burnley versus Sunderland, we were talking about this too. I think a lot of people sort of overplayed Sunderland winning. I myself said that. I don't think the offense of Sunderland is suddenly, some sort of meteorite that you can't stop. They didn't create that many chances versus West Ham. And now we probably look at West Ham even worse as a team 1 week on, right? Whereas with Sunderland now, it's almost like, do we even think too highly of that result given how poor West Ham were? And it's interesting how things like that unfold, right? But that's just what happens when you only have 1 game week of a sample at a time and you have teams that have never played before in the Premier League, or not never played before in the Premier League until, let's say, this season, right? With the current iteration of their teams, right? And the managers that they have, right? So Sunderland didn't create too many chances versus Burnley, so I think a very deserved clean sheet for anyone who actually went for their Burnley picks. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Burnley's a good attack either, right? They didn't create many chances. So these are still very much the teams to target. And you can see Leeds as well. I think I'm not really talk about Daniel Farke's setup, but was it a bit naive? Sure. I mean, anytime you lose 5-0, I think you'd probably suggest that that's the case, even though we think Leeds is maybe the better of the promoted side. So that's pretty much all I have to say about that. They didn't create anything at all, really, versus Arsenal. So that's typical Arsenal. That's what we expect, right? We expected a clean sheet here. The Timber, the Calafiori stuff was just bonkers. You don't see that very often, but it's impressive, right? The Calafiori role and what that is, and also just what Timber can do sometimes on a great day. As far as, let's say, Crystal Palace and Nottingham Forest, I have to say, I mean, I did miss this game, but I kind of saw the chances back, and I just think it's one of those matches where Nottingham Forest are just so good at kind of almost controlling elements of the game and making sure that their opponents just don't overwhelm them. Like, they're not really a team often that I think you'd see utterly collapse, and they continue to just do that very, very well. I don't think Crystal Palace actually racked up too many chances versus them, but I was very happy as an Ismaila Sarr owner. I mean, how can I not be? And then with the Everton match, I think Njai might have come off with a knock. We need to sort of monitor that situation, but Brighton were absolutely horrid. It is an interesting thing to kind of think about how, despite the amount of sales that they've made, they still kind of look quite weak with some reinforcements that are probably a little bit more for the future. I've probably overestimated myself how good Brighton are as a team. But then I'd be eager to see, what happens when a Rutter comes back and some of their other players are a little bit more fit. But they should have scored as well. There's even a penalty, of course. So, I mean, that's obvious, but, you just move on, and congratulations to people who own Everton clean sheets, and especially Tarkowski over Murillo, who I will be thinking about deeply. As far as Fulham and United, I've spoken about that game. Newcastle versus Liverpool. I mean, we're going to see that match, and I'd be curious to see how offensive Liverpool is, how they continue to maybe play in terms of like how their attacks are being built, maybe if there's any sort of consistent long-term changes in terms of, let's say, how they play through the right, what the impact of Frimpong being out will be for this Newcastle team, and how they can sort of try to almost capitalize around that, what the midfield matchup will sort of look like, because we know that the last time that they played in the Carabao Cup, I think it was actually quite overwhelming in favor of Newcastle, and so we just want to see kind of how those matchups continue and how they sort of, deal with each other, especially with Gordon, right, who's actually going to be a very interesting pick over the next few weeks, but once again, a little bit uncertain in terms of how much the transfer window can impact how good of a pick Gordon is going to be. And then in terms of next week, I'd have to say the reason why I don't really like a wild card is it's just not a great game to do it when it's like Liverpool, Arsenal, and maybe actually the core of your draft is going to have a lot of Liverpool and Arsenal players, and you don't really want to be bringing them in such a matchup. So why not just wait a week? I think have a bad game week once again in FPL, and then have the right approach towards some of the best picks in the game. We want a little bit more information about Gakpo and Ekitike and what their minutes will be like. So I think why not get that and actually be able to approach that appropriately. With Villa, that's one more game of sample, right? They're playing at home this time. I think there's no excuses, right? Three weeks in, if you haven't created enough chances, there's definitely some sort of signal that we have to respond to as managers. As far as Forest, this is probably just a good chance to actually just keep a clean sheet for once. They've kind of let it slip the last 2 weeks now, and so I'm also curious just to see what the sort of defensive contribution baselines are. I think a lot of people have been struggling with Elliot Anderson. He's got an 11 out of 12 the last 2 weeks, and that's unfortunate. But then in terms of the center backs and even the fullbacks like Nico Williams, I just haven't seen any impressive numbers whatsoever. Brighton versus City is interesting because I think both teams probably took a step back in game week 2 in terms of how we assess them. So I'll be curious to just see how they do, right? Brighton was a bit of a bogey team for City last year, so let's just see how that goes on. Newcastle, I think, is definitely one. Like, if you were thinking about fixtures to target this week, single game week kind of options that will really help, especially if you're going to wildcard 4 off the back of this. I think Newcastle's one to target. United, so obviously one to target. Chelsea, not so much, but maybe this is a good week to buy into their defense. Like, Tosin's back. Why not consider someone like Tosin? Spurs, why not consider buying a little bit more? It's another home game, even though it is Bournemouth, and we do respect them a lot. Brentford, why not? A lot of cheap players across the board. Some players who are nailed, like Igor Thiago, like he's interesting still. So that's kind of what my thoughts are right now. As far as Everton, I'm not sure. I mean, Wolves have been pretty toothless, but this is such a good opportunity for Wolves to actually finally get into the Premier League scoring. I can only imagine that they'll be able to do it in Game Week 3. So that's kind of where I'm at in terms of how you want to approach things. I just think that there's so much information you can get holding off into a wildcard 4. Just seeing what happens with this sort of striker logjam, right? Like Jackson, Wisa, Isak, all these players who can still play a role in FPL but currently don't, and what that means for, as I said, Ekitike, Gakpo, Gordon even. So I'd like to wait, and the same with Brentford, I suppose. Like, there could be knock-on impacts on Igor Thiago. Dango right now looks like an absolutely lethal pick. We know his underlying stats are amazing, so we'll talk about him in the cheat sheet. But these are all the kind of things that are revolving in my head. And I think in my case, it's a little bit simple because I can only make one move. Whereas for other managers, they have 2 free transfers, and it's almost a bit game-changing in terms of the more aggressive you are, probably the more you prompt an early wild card. The more passive you are, or maybe let's say if you kind of keep things as they are, you're probably still opening your eye up towards a little bit of a later wild card. I think people just need to make a decision right now in terms of, am I committing towards a wild card 4? Am I comfortable with that? Or am I committing to, once again, that wild card 13 that a lot of us tried to do at the start and might be struggling with, especially if you have a little bit more injuries than I do myself. So those are my thoughts. It's a little bit long-winded, but I hope that helps in terms of just thinking and navigating the landscape right now. So we're switching gears here towards the Game Week 3 setup of the My Team pick and rating tool. You can access this with the Pro Suite with Fantasy Football Hub. As you can see, we're in Game Week 3 here. I'm just basically looking at my team going forwards, thinking about what exactly I'm going to do. Clearly, the biggest question is on Palmer. I think there's 2 ways to approach this. Once again, as I mentioned, you take a bit of a short-term approach, go all in on this week, and then just simply think about, you've got too many problems in your team. For example, you have more injuries than myself. You got, for example, Estev in my team is also injured. Maybe I'm not happy with you. I don't like the structure. Maybe Strand Larsson's pissing me off. Watkins is pissing me off. I mean, I'm sure there's countless amounts of players. Like, I've just spoken about two forwards, but there's Mateta, there's Evan Nilsson, Bowen, for example, Fulkrug. Like, the extent of good players, I think we, and maybe I should use good players in quotation marks, but these are all players that I think, from a Game Week 1 perspective, we thought would all be quite solid, and they've all blanked, right? And I can understand people are reaching a bit of a melting point, but it's also an option of, do we just pick the players who've scored points recently? And I think absolutely no. You just have to kind of look at what are the true issues in your team. Like, I think Watkins ultimately, unfortunately, is not a true issue in my team. Palmer is, right? Because I don't exactly know what is happening with him. If I take a short-term approach here and I want to go all in, I kind of think the move for my team is just simply to go towards Cunha. I know that it is suggesting Gakpo here, but I really am. I'm really bought into Cunha's minutes. I think Cunha is the one here in this situation. If I am to wildcard 4, right? This is just simply saying you're looking at one game week, right? I'm sick of my team. I'm sick of seeing all these players. Can I move on from them? And I think this is the way. Like, this is simply it, how you tackle Game Week 3. So this is what I would do within my team. But maybe that's not the way necessarily for what I want to do with my team. So the alternative option, I think, is maybe just to take a bit of a passive approach. Take it on the chin this week, roll, know that Anderson's going to play for Chelsea. I think one of the things that we mentioned this season is that DEFCON has completely changed the way that we think about the game. I think if you have an auto sub that's a bit of a DEFCON-y player and he could actually be quite good, then maybe you should just enjoy that for what it is, right? Like Palmer getting auto subbed for Anderson is not the worst thing in the world. Do I need to 100% make a transfer? No, because what's the knock on with Cunha? He's got City away in the next game, which isn't a particularly good match, although we've just seen City battered away by another team that frequently does get results versus them. And United, to be fair, are one of them, although I think at home, City have always battered United last 2 years. What's the next solution, right? I think even if I go for someone like Gakpo, does it feel like a great transfer? No, because it's still Arsenal for me. So I would rather just roll and take it on the chin. I think I'll play Anderson here. The one transfer that I can kind of see working out a little bit longer term is maybe going for Dorgu, but I'm just so confident in my Spurs defense. I don't really want to move them on this week. Neither do I really want to move Estev on to use my 0.5 in the bank to get Dorgu. So it isn't something that makes a lot of sense for me, because I think the flexibility with 2 free transfers after knowing exactly what is going on after international break will be so important for me with a roll here that I would much rather roll if I'm still seeking to play for a longer wild card, and I am. So I'd rather roll in this situation, right? So that's how I'm going to play my team out in Game Week 4. What is it saying? Remember, in Game Week 4 and 6, this is always frequently the bad weeks for all of us managers. This is Game Week 4, by the way. And then in 2 weeks' time, as you can see, the Game Week rating itself in Game Week 6 is also really poor, even if I optimize. And right now it looks a little bit better because I've got players like Reinders, etc. But Strand Larsson's there. He's a bit flimsy as a pick. I don't exactly know what's going to happen with sort of my team. Maybe it actually right now currently looks better in Game Week 6, but I still think that the key thing that's missing is that Haaland is such a good captaincy on this week. I'm not so sure if I'm fully bought into the combination of Salah and Palmer in this week. Maybe it's actually just I want to go for Haaland. I feel bad missing out on the Haaland captaincy, and I go for something that targets this game week 6 here. And that's potentially what I'm planning to do. In game week 4, I think I just have to take it on the chin. That's simply how I feel. 4 and 6 are going to be bad weeks. The only way you can really circumvent that is probably free hitting one of them and then wildcarding off the other. I'm not planning to wildcard off the other, so that's the kind of situation that I find myself in, but I think it also helps me to